What if the story you have always told about your family is only part of the truth? What if your surname points to one place, your grandparents swore by another, but your DNA quietly preserves a much older map? And what if that map does not just say you are Irish, but hints at where in Ireland your roots held strongest, who passed through your bloodline, and how history itself became family? For many people, Irish identity feels simple. It feels inherited. It feels obvious. But the deeper you go, the more you realize that Irish DNA is not one story. It is a layered record of ancient survival, regional belonging, migration, isolation, conquest, and memory. That is why this topic hits people so deeply. Because it is never just about science. It is about the need to know where you come from. It is about why one county feels personal even if you were not born there. It is about why family stories can feel sacred, yet still leave gaps. And it is about the unsettling possibility that your DNA may confirm some of those stories, complicate others, and completely overturn a few you never thought to question. Most outsiders imagine Ireland as one small island with one broad genetic identity. In their minds, Irish is simply Irish. But that picture is too neat. Researchers who built a fine-scale genetic map of Ireland found that the island is not genetically uniform. They identified distinct clusters that broadly follow geography and history, showing that DNA patterns can still reflect old regional structure across the island. In other words, Ireland may look small on a map, but in genetic memory, it carries many different stories at once. That is where this becomes fascinating. Because when people ask what Irish DNA says about your region, identity, and origins, the answer is not that DNA can hand you a magical label and solve your family history in one click. The real answer is more powerful than that. DNA can preserve signals of where populations stayed more rooted, where outside influence arrived more strongly, and where ancient patterns lasted long enough to still be visible today. It does not read your soul. It does not define your worth. But it can reveal the shape of the historical world that formed your bloodline. Start with region. One of the biggest surprises in Irish genetics is that geography still matters. The west of Ireland often appears more genetically distinct, partly because geography helped preserve older population patterns there. Rugged terrain, distance, and long-term relative isolation can leave behind a stronger sense of continuity. That does not mean every person in the West has some pure and untouched ancestry. No region in Europe is frozen in time. But it does mean that Western populations have often preserved older signals more clearly than places that saw heavier waves of movement and settlement. The East tells a different kind of story. Eastern Ireland was more exposed to outside contact through trade, invasion, settlement, and political change. When you look at the broad history of the island, that makes sense. The East was the side more open to incoming power. And over time, that contact left traces. So when someone's DNA reflects Eastern Irish roots, the story can sometimes be more mixed, more layered, and more entangled with the movement of peoples between Ireland and Britain. Then there is the North, where identity becomes even more complex. Northern genetic patterns are not just about lines on a modern map. They reflect deep movement between Ulster and Scotland, along with later historical events that reshaped population structure. For some people, that means their DNA may show links that feel politically charged today but are historically old, human, and unsurprising when seen across centuries instead of headlines. Research comparing Ireland and Britain at high resolution found especially close genetic links between parts of Ulster and Scotland, alongside broader evidence that geography and historical migrations shaped the patterns still visible now. And that is one reason DNA results can feel so emotional. Because people often want a clean answer. They want one homeland, one line, one pure inheritance. But history rarely gives anyone that gift. History gives mixtures, crossings, departures, survivals, and returns. It gives families that stayed in one place for generations, and families that moved because they had no choice. It gives names that remained, names that changed, and names that were imposed. DNA does not erase that complexity. It exposes it. To understand Irish DNA properly, you also have to go far beyond the medieval period and much deeper into prehistory. Long before surnames, long before counties, long before the Viking Age or Norman arrival, the island was shaped by major population changes. Ancient DNA research from Ireland has shown that both the Neolithic transition and the Bronze Age brought large-scale genetic shifts. In plain language, Ireland was not built by one original people who remained unchanged forever. New populations arrived, mixed, and transformed the island across different eras, leaving biological and cultural legacies that still matter today. That idea alone changes how many people think about origins. Because when we talk casually about being Irish, we often imagine a timeless identity reaching backward in one unbroken line. But genetic history tells a more layered story. The people who became the ancestors of later Irish populations were themselves the result of earlier migrations and admixtures. So your DNA is not simply carrying a modern national identity backward. It is carrying fragments of much older worlds that existed before Ireland looked the way we think of it now. And then come the invaders, settlers, and outsiders who left marks on the historical imagination of Ireland. Vikings are the most dramatic example in the public mind. For years, many people pictured Viking influence in Ireland as something visible mainly in archaeology, place names, and history books. But genetics made that picture harder to keep at a distance. Studies connected to Irish and wider Viking-era DNA have shown that Norse influence was not just cultural or military. It also entered the gene pool. Researchers found evidence of admixture events into Ireland, and later Viking genetic work showed strong Norwegian links among Irish Viking remains as well as interactions with locals. That matters because it turns invasion into inheritance. The raiders who arrived by sea did not just burn and leave. In at least some places, they stayed, mixed, married, traded, settled, and became part of the human story of the island. So when people ask, "How Irish am I if I have Scandinavian ancestry?" they may be asking the wrong question. The better question is this: how many times did the history of Ireland absorb newcomers and still remain unmistakably Irish? The answer is, more than once. The same principle applies to other layers of contact. Norman influence, British influence, plantation-era movement, ongoing exchange across the Irish Sea. None of these erased Irish identity. They complicated it. They changed local populations unevenly. They affected some regions more than others. And they remind us that regional DNA is often less about neat ethnic boxes and more about historical pressure. Some regions absorbed more outside input. Some preserved older internal continuity. Most carry both, just in different proportions and combinations. This is where a lot of people become obsessed with ancestry tests, because they want DNA to settle arguments that family stories never could. One grandparent says the family is from Cork. Another insists Mayo. A surname sounds strongly Gaelic. A tradition points to Ulster. And then the results arrive, and suddenly the story becomes messy. That can be uncomfortable, but it can also be illuminating. Because surnames, for all their power, do not always tell the full truth. A surname can travel. A surname can be anglicized. A surname can be adopted, altered, shortened, translated, or attached to a family line that moved far from its earlier origins. Over generations, people also marry across counties, across regions, and across identities. So a name might preserve one visible part of the story while DNA preserves several older and less obvious layers beneath it. That is why some people discover that their name points one way, but their genetic signals lean another. The name is not necessarily false. It is simply not the whole archive. And then there is the question people often do not say out loud. If my DNA reveals something unexpected, does that change who I am? If there is Scottish ancestry in the north, Norse ancestry in the east, British admixture in one line, or deeper regional roots somewhere my family never mentioned, does that make me less Irish? For many people, that fear sits quietly underneath the excitement of testing. The honest answer is no. DNA can inform identity, but it does not own it. Identity is also memory, culture, belonging, language, loyalty, and lived experience. What DNA can do is show that Irishness itself was never formed in a vacuum. It was forged through endurance, continuity, adaptation, and contact with others. So unexpected ancestry is not always a threat to identity. Sometimes it is proof of how identity survives history rather than escaping it. That is one reason Irish DNA feels so different from shallow ancestry marketing. In advertisements, heritage is often presented like a shopping list of percentages. A little of this. A little of that. But real population history is not a party trick. It is a long human drama. It is shaped by who arrived, who stayed, who married, who was displaced, who crossed the sea, who retreated into isolated regions, and who passed their genes forward despite famine, war, colonization, and exile. It also explains why some people's results feel strongly regional while others look far more blended. If one family line stayed rooted in the same area for many generations, the regional signal may remain clearer. If another family line moved repeatedly because of land pressure, work, marriage, upheaval, or migration, the result can become more mixed. Neither result is more authentic. They simply reflect different historical paths. Some families were anchored. Some were mobile. Most were both at different times. And this leads to one of the most powerful truths in all of ancestry research. Family stories matter. They matter because they carry meaning. They carry emotion. They carry the names, places, and loyalties that shaped a person's sense of self. But family stories are not the same as genetic memory. Oral memory can preserve one chapter and lose 3 others. DNA can preserve an older layer that nobody living remembered to tell. When those two things meet, the result can be disorienting. But it can also be beautiful. Because maybe your family did not lie. Maybe they simply inherited one thread and not the full tapestry. Maybe the county they named was the place of a more recent ancestor, while your DNA still holds traces of an older homeland further west, further north, or across a sea route that mattered 1,000 years ago. Maybe the story passed down at the table was true, but incomplete. And maybe that is what origin really is for most people, not a single answer, but a stack of truths from different times. So what does Irish DNA really say about your region, identity, and origins? It says that region still leaves a mark. It says geography mattered. It says history did not land evenly across the island. It says some parts of Ireland preserved older genetic structure more clearly, while others show stronger evidence of outside contact and admixture. It says Viking and British linked inputs are part of the story, not the whole story. And it says that the island's deep past reaches far beyond modern labels into prehistoric migrations that helped shape the people who would later become the Irish. But maybe the most important thing it says is this. You are not the product of one moment. You are the result of a chain. A long one. A fragile one. A miraculous one. Somewhere behind your face and your name are coastlines crossed, battles survived, families joined, languages lost, traditions kept, and places loved hard enough to be remembered. DNA cannot tell you everything. It cannot measure your loyalty to a land, or your love for a people, or the meaning of the stories that raised you. But it can remind you that your origins are older, richer, and more layered than you were ever meant to imagine. And perhaps that is why people keep coming back to this question. Not because they want data alone, but because they want connection. They want to know why certain places feel familiar. Why certain names feel heavy. Why a county they have never lived in can still feel like home. In that sense, Irish DNA is not simply about biology. It is about the strange persistence of belonging. The way history lingers in bodies. The way memory survives even when names and records fail. So whether your results point to Western continuity, Northern complexity, Eastern mixture, ancient layers beneath modern identity, or surprises your family never saw coming, the message is not that your story has been broken. The message is that your story is bigger than you thought. And on an island like Ireland, that may be the most Irish truth of all. If this story made you think differently about your own roots, comment with your Irish surname, your county, or the biggest surprise in your ancestry story. And if you want more videos on Irish surnames, regional identity, Viking roots, ancient ancestry, and the hidden history behind Irish names and bloodlines, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.